The Olympic Games, the brainchild of Pierre de Coubertin, he conceived it as a great event that would usher in world peace. This is the Olympic spirit, characterized by values such as friendship, mutual understanding, peace, and even human rights and democracy. However, the further time lapsed on from the late 19th and into the 20th century, the muddier the waters became. The idea that Nazis would host an Olympic Games would seem preposterous to anyone illiterate in history. This terrifying trend of 20th century brutality would come to its zenith when nuclear armaments were detonated above Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August of 1945. How were two nations supposed to engage in total warfare with the threat of total nuclear annihilation looming over their heads? The answer is simple: they couldn't. But still, nukes may have ended total war. It had not ended total conflict, for indeed the conflict would find a way. The Cold War, the war between the East and the West, was a war of ideology. Of course, an idea takes decades to trial. In the meantime, the East and the West would find passive ways to sabotage each other. This begs us the question: what was the significance of the 1980 and 1984 Olympic Games in reflecting and heightening Cold War tensions? The feud between the East and the West began almost as soon as World War II ended. The war for the next few decades was characterized by nationalist posturing. The Soviets would catch up to their American rivals and build nukes of their own by 1953. The Americans would counter this by making it to the moon first in 1968. The posturing would continue right to 1975, where representatives from the Soviet states and the US would sign the Helsinki Accords. Although legally the Accords were rather benign, they did play an important role in the development of thinking about human rights. The conversation on human rights became especially pertinent in 1979. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan was most representative of Cold War conflict. In retaliation, the US led a boycott of the 1980 Moscow Olympics, which was complemented by the boycotting of the 1984 Los Angeles Olympics by the Soviet Union. Depending on the historian, this event has been espoused as significant, with a 2001 PhD dissertation labeling the Moscow boycott as, quote, the last crisis of the Cold War, end quote. Now, the US president at the time, Jimmy Carter, was deeply inspired by the Helsinki Accords, and, from 1977 onward, human rights became a leading element of US foreign policy. Emboldened by his moralistic stance, and eager to retaliate, the American House of Representatives and the Senate voted with overwhelming favor to request their American Olympic Committee to appeal to the International Olympic Committee to strip Moscow of its hosting privileges. Quote, we must make it clear to the Soviet Union that it cannot trample upon an independent nation, and at the same time do business as usual with the rest of the world. End quote. On the screen, I've broken down the legal rigmarole of the Helsinki Accords that the USA would use to justify the boycotting. The important thing is that, yes, the Soviets had obviously broken human rights accords by invading another nation. However, America had grossly bent the accords by discouraging contacts in the field of sport. Such is the messy political machinations of the opposing East and West. In the end, 65 states pulled out of the Olympic Games in Moscow, robbing them of the sense of international legitimacy that the Games normally provide the Olympic host. However, on the plus side, the USSR did keep majority of the gold medals. Now, alongside this, the rest of the world was quite unhappy with the Soviet Union. They had violently suppressed rebellions, invaded Afghanistan, squashed sedition and killed free speech. They had even created slave labour in their gulags, perhaps even amounting to 5.5 million people held in forced labour. The negative press led to feelings of persecution among the Soviet leaders. Now, based on the evidence, it is unlikely that the Soviets had always planned to boycott the LA Olympics. Contacts between the USA and the Soviets between 1980 and 1984 were lively. In fact, at the time, Soviet International Olympic Committee member Konstantin Adrianov said the LA organizers had done a great job. It all changed when Soviet leader Andropov passed away and was replaced by Chernenko. Compared with Andropov, Chernenko was far more conservative and was a close colleague of the Soviet leader reigning during the time of the Moscow boycott. The official reason for the boycott was safety concerns. The negative sentiment towards the Soviets, exacerbated by their shooting down of a Korean airliner in 1983, were deemed threatening. The Soviets claimed that agents from Soviet hate groups like the Ban the Soviet Coalition were persecuting them and sending threatening letters. It is said that during wartime the first casualty is truth, and there is no truer sentiment than is present in the Soviet Union. This sentiment is a double entendre in that it is likely the real reason for the boycott was revenge. The other side of that is that broadcasting of the Olympics to the Soviet states is heavily censored. Back home in Russia, Soviet economics were failing and the quality of life was low. The injury of this would be exacerbated if Soviet citizens could see the American way of life, a privilege that would not be afforded until the end of the decade with perestroika. No, the Soviets would witness Olympic broadcasting through Soviet-narrated radio. In the end, the Soviets would retaliate against the West by coercing 13 of the communist states, including Afghanistan, into abstaining from participating in the LA Olympics. Of course, actually engaging in war with the enemy is too risky in the world of nuclear warfare. It seems much safer to just decline your enemy's invitation to their sports event. The point is that the Cold War, characterized by passivity and inaction, took advantage of an event that was supposed to be characterized by peace. No doubt Pierre de Coubertin would have rolled in his grave.